Lascan Corla, the distinguished programme is the programme that breaches the consensus of a society and shows the audience the world in a different light. At the root of every good programme is conflict, because you cannot have a consensus-shattering moment without conflict. All distinguished programmes cause offence to somebody who wants to cling to a shibboleth or a sacred cow or a position that is no longer borne out by the facts. These are the words of the late Jack Dowling, who worked as a producer in RTE until 1969. And Mr. Dowling's words, penned years ago, go right to the heart of this morning's debate. I'd like to thank the Ceann Comhairle for choosing the Broadcasting Amendment Bill for debate this morning. I'd in particular like to thank the Minister for his time this morning and in preparing for this bill, and to my fellow Dáil deputies for their time, their consideration and their contributions today. In preparing for this bill, we introduced a wide number of people involved in broadcasting, from presenters to contributors to editors to senior managers. I'd like to thank all of them for their time, their expertise and their contributions. Strong democracies live or die by free speech. Our ability to debate openly allows society to regard itself, to tackle its shortcomings, to recognise its strengths, to improve and to withstand crisis. Full and frank debate across all media is not commendable, it is not nice to have, it is an absolutely essential ingredient in our ability to grow and evolve together. When we hobble such debate, we end up with groupthink, with the marginalisation of dissenting voices, and with the failure to recognise when our social and political norms have become stale and outdated. The importance of open debate is something we recognise in the Oireachtas. In the Dáil, the Seanad and in committees, we have created a legal bubble for ourselves. The ability to speak under privilege, free from the fear of legal proceedings being taken against us if we need to speak truth to power, if we need to speak of wrongdoing by rich or powerful individuals or rich or powerful organisations. The freedom of speech must, of course, go hand in hand with responsibility. If any of us, through our words, seek to damage another based on false evidence, we can be held to account through the defamation laws. If any of us seek to incite hatred, we can be held to account through the Incitement to Hatred Prohibition Act. These laws seek to balance the need for and right to freedom of speech with the obligations that go with such freedoms. Now, this is a difficult task, and inevitably, legislation may contain errors where the balance is tipped too far in one direction or indeed the other. This bill, Lascan Comhairle, seeks to rectify one such error. The 2009 Broadcasting Act lays out the responsibility of television and radio broadcasters. Section 39(1)(d) of the Act reads as follows: "Every broadcaster shall ensure that anything which may be reasonably regarded as causing harm or offence, or as being likely to promote or incite to crime, or is tending to undermine the authority of the state, is not broadcast by the broadcaster." The problem here, Lascan Comhairle, is the inclusion of the word offence. Under the Act, broadcasters are legally obliged to ensure that nothing is broadcast which may reasonably be regarded as causing offence. Now, the bill before the House this morning is very simple. It's just one line. It has nothing to do with the defamation laws. It has nothing to do with most of the Broadcasting Act. It does one thing. It removes the word offence from Section 39 of the Broadcasting Act. So why go to so much trouble to remove one word? Why go to the time and effort of doing the research, of interviewing people, of drafting the bill, of seeking to have it put before the House this morning? Why ask for the time of the Minister? Why ask for the time of my fellow deputies? Because including the word offence is utterly contrary to the ideals of free speech. Because including the word offence is undermining free speech every single day in our broadcast media. George Orwell famously said that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear, something I think all of us in this House might regard with a wry appreciation. Now, closer to home, President Michael D. Higgins said just last June to the International Federation of Journalists that it is critical that journalists can and must be allowed to speak the truth without fear or sanction, and that citizens must be allowed to evaluate and weigh an array of accurate and impartially provided evidence and come to independent conclusions of their own. How are broadcasters expected to be able to speak the truth if they are not allowed cause offence? How, in this non-offensive world, can broadcasters and journalists speak truth to power? One journalist we interviewed pointed out that journalists, including broadcasters, have an obligation to hold institutions and persons of power to account. Invariably, the holders of power come, at some stage, to regard imposition of accountability upon them as offensive. It seems to be, therefore, not just that journalists may be offensive to some people at some stages, but it is obligatory on journalists to be so. Otherwise, they are probably not doing their job. I think we would all agree that we have far too many examples in Ireland of those in authority and the organisations they work for not being held to account because people were afraid to speak out. Imagine asking broadcasters to shine a light on wrongdoing, on abuse, on special interests, without causing anyone offence. It would be impossible. And yet that is exactly what Section 39 of the Broadcasting Act requires them to do. Imagine a world where we're not allowed cause offence to anybody. One person's reasonable comment is another person's reasonable offence. And so every person's reasonable comment may be censored for fear of reasonable offence. I think, Minister, if the law were fully enforced, that yourself, myself, and many other deputies in this House would find ourselves in broadcast medium a lot less often. Now, it is, of course, entirely legitimate to be offended by what people say. Of course it is. In what many regard as his finest contribution to Dáil Éireann, An Taoiseach said that, quote, "The rape and torture of children were downplayed or managed to uphold instead the primacy of the institution, its power, standing and reputation." And no doubt, these words caused very great offence to some people. Now, as the law stands, therefore, the Taoiseach's speech shouldn't have been broadcast. It is entirely legitimate for people to have been offended by what the Taoiseach said. It is entirely illegitimate to censor the Taoiseach because of that offence. Now, the argument for removing the word offence is not just academic. It's true that the Taoiseach's speech was broadcast, but we heard directly from broadcasters that the inclusion of the word offence in the Broadcasting Act is actively restricting free speech in Ireland every day. Here's how one broadcaster explained it. The offensive test has two ill effects. Firstly, it limits the degree to which broadcasters can examine some contentious topics. And secondly, it breeds homogeny amongst broadcasters. The Pantygate example illustrates how many broadcasters could only offer stunted coverage of an issue of major public debate. Now, some broadcasters pointed out that not only does the inclusion of the word offence allow people to shut down debate they are uncomfortable with, it allows a tiny number of people to shut down debate for the whole population across a wide range of issues. As one said, one person's truth is always going to be offensive to somebody. Part of the problem is that the onus is put on the broadcaster in the Act. There is already a legal onus on contributors to avoid defaming people, which is right and proper, but the Broadcasting Act puts responsibility on the broadcaster not just to avoid defamation, but to restrict contributors from saying anything that anyone may reasonably take offence at. One correspondent we spoke to said the following: if a person themselves believes that what they say to be the truth, and if their experience rings true to a situation, then it's up to that person to prove it. It is not necessarily up to the broadcaster in that instance to modulate the debate, and yet the law requires it. Another part of the problem is that offence, or reasonable offence, is entirely subjective. It cannot be measured, it cannot be tested for, and so it cannot be rebutted. It was pointed out in interviews, offence is by its nature subjective, and there is no barometer to determine what is offensive to society at large, or what is not. Another commented that you cannot legislate for what's offensive. What's giving offence? One man's offence is another man's reasonable comment. It's nonsense. It was a direct quote. So it was one man's was the direct quote. If we cannot, under normal conditions, define, measure or test for offence, then it is preposterous to legally mandate broadcasters to filter it out, particularly in the world of live broadcasting. They can't. So what do? They err on the side of caution. They make editorial decisions to stay away from certain topics and certain people. And in so doing, freedom of speech in Ireland is badly damaged. Here's how one journalist described the situation today due to the inclusion of the word offence. There is a pathological fear of causing offence in large media organisations, now more so than ever. Everyone has the right to their truth and their story as long as they're not lying about it or not setting out with some kind of agenda to attack somebody else. People are afraid to tell their stories anymore. It's a much poorer society. If you have a situation where people from minorities, people who are in some way damaged or compromised, are on the margins, are not allowed to tell their stories. So what's the solution? This is why the effort was spent in getting this bill before the House this morning, because of that one little word, offence. Because it has fostered a culture of fear and caution in our national media that must not be allowed to exist. Our broadcasters must be able to ask the hard questions and to probe the difficult issues, whether people are offended by those questions or not. This is a simple bill. It does not seek to update every component of freedom of speech in Ireland. It doesn't seek to update the defamation laws. It doesn't seek to update any other parts of the broadcasting bill. It aims to do one thing: to reduce the culture of fear and caution that broadcasters are telling us exists every day in every newsroom, and in so doing, to radically improve freedom of speech in our country. One broadcaster summed up the objective of this bill as follows: the reason offence should be removed from the Act is that it cannot be defined by legislation. Libel can only be decided in court. One person's offence is another person's fair comment. To have this in legislation means broadcasters are simply shackled by guidelines over what they can and cannot do. If I don't know what it means, how can I do my job properly? What is terrible is that legislators seem to be differentiating between radio, television and newspaper. That's extraordinary because of the Passover of people. Eamon Dunphy writes and speaks, Matt Cooper writes and speaks. If we attempt to shut down critical media in the supposed pursuit of democracy, we make a mistake which will come back to haunt future generations. Another hope this bill would pass for the following reason. Quote, it would make our jobs easier and it would make for a richer democracy. Right now we are forced to self-censor. The media are left to decide what is offensive and what is not offensive. The referendum next year is going to be stunted for fear of offending people. In accepting this bill, Minister, you and the Cabinet, and indeed all of us in the Oireachtas, can send out a powerful message. That freedom of speech is highly valued in Ireland. That broadcasters have an obligation to probe and to question and to speak truth to power. And that that obligation invariably results in people sometimes being offended, and that is okay. I commend this bill to the House.
No call on Minister Pat Rabbitte. Minister, 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Laskin Corlia. I'm conscious in dealing with this issue that this Friday legislative slot was set aside to allow deputies, and in particular opposition deputies, to advance bills that could otherwise only be taken in private members' business, or not at all. This reform was intended to facilitate deputies who have a particular interest or reform in mind, and who require a fair wind to translate it into law. There have been private members' bills adopted in the past, but they have been too few, and invariably they have been of some substance. This one-section bill is scarcely what was envisaged when the change to Dáil procedure was made. There was no need to cause the House to assemble this morning to make a point that might have been raised in several other routine ways. Rather than dismiss it as a stunt, I will give the deputy the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps he didn't expect to be selected, or he didn't have time to produce a considered bill. The bill derives from a remark of mine published in the Irish Times during the so-called Pantygate affair, when I said that, in the context of a wider revision of the Broadcasting Act, I was considering an amendment that would require broadcasters to avoid causing undue offence. At the moment, Section 39 of the Act requires every broadcaster to ensure that nothing is broadcast that may reasonably be regarded as causing harm or offence. I said in the wake of the programme in question that the more objectively ascertainable test would be to impose a requirement not to cause harm or undue offence. This comment appears to have been whimsically latched onto by the Deputy, who now, in this hurried one-section bill, proposes simply to excise the term offence. Last Concordia, legislating from the hip for a passing headline is not appropriate in a complex area, nor would it improve the quality of public debate. A more nuanced approach is required if broadcasting standards are to be maintained, and we are to avoid broadcasters seeking controversy in the pursuit of ratings. What this bill proposes is the reinstallation of Section 39(1)(d) of the Broadcasting Act 2009, minus the two words, or offence. And the author so proposes, in the full knowledge that a full refurbishment of the 2009 Act is underway. Put simply, the totality of the bill is the excision of two words, or offence. What would happen if colleagues in the House generally started to trawl through statutes based on something they hear over the cornflakes, or it says in the papers, and resolve to excise two words they don't like and call it a bill, and then fall back on arguments to defend this legislative ingenuity comprising whatever is popular at the time? I'd rather take the Deputy's initiative this morning as an indication that he wants to debate the issue, and I'm happy to engage with them on that. But I'm not happy to be associated with any move that would seek to debase broadcasting standards in this country to what we see, for example, in the United States. I don't want to turn the national broadcaster or any other broadcaster into a version of the Jerry Springer show.